Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 289 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am your host, the Orange Tank Nealon, and with me today, making up the best duo.
That's right.
Some counterbalance from that show a few weeks ago. Mark the Green Tank.
Hey, hello, yes. All three of our flanks are not fully covered, as we made clear in a previous episode. We are without Callan the Red Tank, but as Nealon said, this is the best duo, so we are ready to go.
Always has been. And who better to bring you the hottest games that will be showing next week at Essen SPIEL in Germany. This is one of the biggest conventions in the world, if not the biggest board game convention in the world.
Yeah, I think by a lot of metrics it is.
Yeah, I guess so, right? And yeah, it is always a hotbed of new cool releases, and we are going to wade through the 1,000 plus games on the BGG preview list to give you our
top 1,000 ranked games.
Yeah, exactly.
1,000 to 1.
In ranked order, all 1,000. Right. Before we do that, though, we are going to be talking about some of the games that we've been playing this week. And this week, Mark has been playing Asara and Skytear Horde. And I have been playing Dwellings of Eldervale. Let's kick it off with Asara.
Yeah. Actually, before we get into Asara, Neil, I have a question for you. In our communication on the Discord and stuff, like as we're getting episodes ready and stuff, I'll often do something, and in thanking me, you'll reply with TA.
Yeah.
I'm always trying to figure out what that means. I think you've maybe told me at some point, but is it like...
So
it's not like an abbreviation for thanks or something.
No. I don't actually honestly know. So it's ta, which is just like a English short form slang for thanks.
Okay.
It's something my mum would say. It's something my aunt would say. I just picked it up from them at some point.
It does feel very Englishy to me, but I was never sure if I was missing some further depth to it. But anyhow, so I want to...
the funny thing is I don't ever say it in person. It just became kind of like a thing of my internet talk.
Yeah. I've definitely never heard you say it in the flesh. So anyhow, but back to the game. So one thing I enjoy about the Vegas gaming group that I've played with is that they are very willing to play both a mix of old and new games. There's a nice balance between getting to play a lot of the newer stuff while also being happy to revisit some older gems. And so it was doing some of this revisiting that we got a chance to play Asara. So this is a game all the way back from 2010, put out by Ravensburger and designed by the dynamic design duo of Kramer and Kiesling. These are the designers that brought you games like the Mask Trilogy, Tikal, Torres. They have on their own designed games like El Grande, Palaces of Carrara, Azul. So heavyweights in the design space for sure. And so if I say the words 2010, a board game designed in 2010, and I say Kramer and Kiesling, and I say that the game is named after a city famous from antiquity, and I tell you then it's about building towers, you might have a picture in your mind about what kind of game this is. And I am here to tell you that in this case, you are almost certainly right about what you're expecting. But in case those phrases and ideas don't really coalesce into an idea in your head, let's talk about how you build these towers in Asara. So Asara is basically a worker placement game, although instead of placing meeples, as you do in many worker placement games, you're going to be placing cards that make up your hand in various spots on the board. I'll talk a little bit more about the spots in a second, but a nice twist to talk about here is how the card/worker placement works in Asara. So there are a number of different discrete locations where you are going to be going to gather resources. And as I said, you place your workers in these spots by playing cards out of your hand to the locations to gather the resources. The cards themselves come in, I believe it's 5 different colors. There's no number, there's nothing, it's just the colors are the only thing that matters about the cards. And the trick is that whoever goes to a location first gets to place whatever color they want to activate the spot. But everyone who subsequently wants to go to that location in the round can only go there by playing the same color card. So if Nealon goes to the spot to get tower tops first and he plays a green card to it, if I want to tower top that round, I need to play a green card from my hand into that location in order to get one. If I have it, of course. If I don't have a green card, I can play 2 of any color cards face down as a wild, but the cards in your hand that you draw at the beginning of each round also act as your action capital for the round. So if you play 2 cards instead of 1, you're potentially halving the number of actions you could have done with those 2 cards. Instead of using those 2 cards to take 2 different actions in the round, you're spending them both as a wild, but only getting 1 action. The spots where you're placing these cards/workers are pretty straightforward. There's a spot to get the bases to your towers, a spot to, as I mentioned, get the tops to the towers, and a couple spots to get the middle pieces. In addition to paying with your card for the right to get the pieces, you also need to actually pay for the pieces, with some colors of towers being more expensive than others. So, for example, if you go to a spot to get a white tower piece, it might cost you 8 gold in addition to the card that you play, while if you go to a spot to get a brown piece, it only costs 3. So some colors of towers that you're building are more expensive than others. There are also spots where you can acquire more cards, get more money, and finally a spot where you have to go to actually construct the pieces that you've been acquiring into towers. So you go to all these spots to get pieces of towers, but to actually build the towers, you need to go to this main spot that's in the center of the board. And this is a pretty interesting location because on one hand, you want to go there first because you want to make sure that you have the color in hand to actually build, which is how you get your points. So there's this urge to get there quickly to make sure you sort of set the color. On the other hand, as you might have guessed, you would prefer to go there late as possible because you want to gather as many resources during the course of the round to make that building action as efficient as possible. So it's an interesting sort of push-pull at that spot. You're going to keep doing this until everybody runs out of cards, which signals the end of a round. And then there's a minor scoring at the end of every round where you're going to be getting points based on the number of towers you've built, as well as every golden adorned piece that you've built, which is a subset of the tower pieces. So, for example, among all the black tower pieces in the game, some percentage of them have these golden flourishes, and each one of those scores you a point in the intermittent scoring. You're going to keep doing that until you get to the end of the game, where there's going to be an area majority-ish sort of scoring where the person with the tallest and the second tallest tower in each color will get a number of points, a relatively large amount of points based on how expensive the tower is. So, for example, at the end of the game, whoever has the tallest brown tower will get some number of points, and second will get some number of points, all the way up to the white tower, which is the most expensive one to build, and that person, whoever has to build the tallest one of that, will get an even larger amount of points, which is where you get most of your scoring. There's also a sizable bonus for the player who builds the most overall number of towers, and then finally another fairly big bonus for the person who builds the single tallest tower in the game. And that is Asara. As people are building towers, you can sort of look and see what towers you're behind in. Is it even worth it to go for red? Because Neelan's tower is already 5, and I don't have the time to go for it. But even though you sort of sacrifice winning the tower, there's points to be gained for just building one because you get points for the number of towers built. So it's nice that it's clear to see where people stand and what sort of colors you can go after. Anyway, so immediately after playing it, my initial thought was, this game feels like the Spiel game to me. Like a solidly family weight, really easy to teach, really easy to play, completely sound in its design, in terms of like mathematical and all that. And I feel like this is the type of game that the Ward is sort of made for. Perfect in that weight and that accessibility. And then I found out that game actually was a finalist for the 2011 Spiel. Lost to Quirkle, but it was up there. But it seemed amazingly fitting. It just screamed Spiel to me, and to find out that it was nominated was pretty perfect. I really liked Asara for all the reasons I've talked about, liking these older, often forgotten Euros, like really simple rule set. You get up and go and start playing so quickly, and generally these games are really soundly built, at least the ones that have stood the test of time. And you really feel all those interesting decisions all over the place. I will say that in subsequent plays, the game has been a little maybe less exciting as the decision space sort of seems to be relatively straightforward. It doesn't necessarily feel like a game that will bloom, as I said, like last week or on the last episode, in terms of the interesting choices after repeated plays and some of the ways games that I've talked about in the past, like Tramways or even Jaipur, have for me. But still, it's absolutely solid. Feels like a great game to introduce to family and friends who maybe like board games in general, but aren't interested in the 30-minute rules explanation or something like overly complicated, and want something that's cozy while still offering interesting mechanisms and decisions. Just absolutely solid, if maybe unspectacular game, but I would definitely recommend Asara for someone looking for one of those classic old school Euro hidden gem type games. So that is Asara by Kramer and Kiesling, released by Ravensburger.
It is also very bright and colorful,
yes.
Which at least when you were mentioning like this is exactly what you imagine for the 2010 Euro type game, it's not brown.
Yes,
it's quite lovely.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it is not that necessarily overly earth shade sort of dark game or overly brown. So yeah, it is colorful and inviting in that sense. And again, another reason why it feels like such a Spiel sort of game is just really welcoming. And before I pass the baton to Neelan, I wanted to mention that I also got a chance to play a game that he talked about on a previous episode, Skytear Horde. In fact, I was planning to talk about Skytear Horde as my main game, and then in doing research about it, I was like, oh, Board Game Barrage has talked about this game. I completely forgot. Neelan had talked about it. But to refresh people's memories, including my own, because I, again, had completely forgotten, Skytear Horde is a game that can play in multiple modes. There's a solo mode, a co-op mode, and then a competitive mode. I think it's really only made really for the solo. Like it feels like the only way I would recommend it. To be frank, I haven't played it in the other modes, but the co-op feels like basically like a solo split into like halves where everybody's playing like part of a game, and the competitive just doesn't feel like it's what you would want from a competitive game. But what it is I'm going to call it a solo tower defense sort of MOBA style. I've heard it's a Hearthstone type of game, although I don't have experience with Hearthstone, but I also have heard Magic the Gathering-esque in terms of the way the cards combo with each other. But it's a game where...
Yeah, I would say all of that tracks pretty well.
Yeah.
Like, I think they're all kind of like playing in similar areas, and Skytear Horde, a pretty good combo of them all.
Yeah, so what you're basically doing is you're trying to defeat a boss and also maybe close a portal if you can where enemies are sort of, escaping and attacking you, again, tower defense style, and you can lose in a couple ways if your tower gets destroyed by the onslaught, or if your deck of cards, which sort of acts as your supply of allies and spells, gets depleted, and then you can win by beating the big bad guy. All of it plays in about 60 minutes in my experience, and I liked it. I think that I probably enjoyed it more than most people who are very familiar with tower defense games or Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone, because I've heard from people who have played it who are more familiar with those types of games, especially Hearthstone and Magic, that they find it relatively unspectacular or maybe uninteresting. But I liked it. I think it offers a lot of different mechanisms that sort of skirt the edge of being a little clunky, but I think it all worked for me. And I've only played, the base game comes with 3 different factions that play different ways and 3 different bad guys. So I haven't explored all of them, but my first impressions have been positive. Just like a solo game that plays relatively quickly, that offers a lot of tough decisions and is challenging. So I enjoyed it. I can't remember where you landed on it exactly, Neelan.
I was pretty middling on it, to be honest, and pretty much for the reasons you mentioned, which kind of nails my take on it, which is to say that as someone that was intimately familiar with both Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone for a time, it's like those games largely depend on you eventually building up effectively like a tableau, for lack of a better word. Creatures and artifacts and spells are all synergized and work together. But by the nature of Skytear Horde, it's more about you constantly just feel like you're on the back foot. So your creatures are constantly dying. So you're never really building up in that sense. You're always just hanging on. So it never feels like you're comboing in any effective way. It's just, okay, well, I hope the next thing in my deck is going to be effective in this scenario, which, that's not exactly what I want from a game that plays.
It also, that part of it also is hurt. And hurt is like more pejorative than I intend, but hurt by the fact that you only get cards in your hand when you defeat enemies. So it's not like you're drawing every round and then potentially building up these combos. You have to sort of like really, really work for the combos, and it can be frustrating.
Yeah.
It doesn't work out.
Totally. And by design, you're whittling your own cards down to be allowed to draw more. So exactly. It never lets you really build up in a satisfying way.
So that is Skytear Horde by Giacomo and Riccardo Neri, and published by Skytear Games.
So Kellen, Christina, and I played a game of Dwellings of Eldervale. This was just yesterday, actually, and it's a shame that neither of them is available to talk about it, because I think we would have some fun being spicy about this one. Dwellings of Eldervale had been recommended through several sources to me for some time, and Kellen and I had both been very excited for a long time to get it. It being very fabulously out of print for a very long time, and just the now second edition has just started to ship out to people. So I was excited to get this to the table. The gist of this is that it is a worker placement area control hybrid. So it has some elements and feel of sort of a troops on the map type thing, but the primary action is effectively a form of worker placement. So the way that works, and this is a game that is very sort of kitchen sinky with a lot of its elements, so I'm certainly not going to explain everything, but the basic thrust of what you're doing is you have this hex map, right? And you have some workers that you will start by putting out into an empty space on the board. Now, every hex on the board is effectively like a worker placement action spot. So you put your worker onto the space as long as it's unoccupied, and then you take the action of that space, which is just typically getting some resources or using those resources for things like acquiring cards, getting more workers, and so on. The twist here is that in every subsequent action after your first placement, your next worker has to both be adjacent to a worker you placed previously and is now allowed to move into a space that is occupied by another player. So when you do that, you take the action as before, you resolve it fully, but then you're fighting a battle. Okay? So depending on however many people are surrounding, other players might join the battle, even if you're not even initially in the battle. Like Christina might just be like, yeah, I'm going to slide into here. So you could just end up with these big melees with other people's workers kind of just scrabbling into this spot in the middle. You roll a bunch of dice, one player wins and is left to occupy that space. Everyone else goes to the graveyard. And the reason that can be quite punishing is through the second half of the actions in this game, which is this regroup action. So when you essentially run out of workers, or when it's advantageous for you to do so, you'll take a turn just to pull all of your people off of the board. And when you do that, you can trigger cards in your tableau, which kind of have their own actions on them. So any person that comes off of the board, I can place it to a card to trigger an action, get some quite good benefits. The downside to them dying means you can't use them to activate those cards. So there is some sense you're trying to put them out into places, keep them alive so that when you regroup them, you can get actions from them as well. Layered on top of this are monsters that are roaming the world. A whole bunch of different cards, both in the form of like magic cards that go in your hand that give you sort of spells and effects and quests and end of game scoring, and sort of this tableau building system where as you sort of do this dungeon action, you get these new cards going into your tableau, which give you the new actions that you can take when you regroup. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is convert your workers into dwellings and go up on one of these several element tracks. That is going to be a multiplier in all of your scoring. So at the end of the game, if I am occupying, say, the 5-point spot on the green element track, then all of my green houses are worth 5 points. All of my green cards are worth 5 points. So they kind of combo off each other in that way. And that's kind of the large chunk of your scoring. So it's about trying to find opportunities to build up the resources you need to build dwellings while stepping in order to fight people out of the spaces that you need, get their board presence out of the way, and so on. The other extra layers in all of this that are quite good is that there are different unit types. There's a soldier unit that you can buy that is slightly more effective at going in and starting fights. There's a wizard unit that you can teleport to anywhere on the map. It doesn't have to be adjacent. There's a dragon unit that's really good at fighting. So there are some fun things thrown into the mix here of, I know that Kellen's recruited his dragon. Is he going to put it on the board now to take an action or hold it back so he can fight me with it later? But there is also a lot of craft baked into this. These monsters roaming around, as you sort of move into a hex, they kind of move into a space and then start, you're fighting a battle against these neutral monsters. Defeating the monsters gets you a reward, but they often are just like occupying spots that make it really frustrating. Because if I go next to this spot, then I have to fight this battle and potentially lose my workers. The magic cards in the game have just a very kind of wonky balance to them, where some of them just feel very inconsistent in how powerful they are. There were some where you just felt like this really powerful action, and then some as a quest that's going to be really hard to complete and is going to give you like a smattering of points. So there's just a lot of weird funkiness to it. But the thing that kind of bums me out about it is I actually think the core of what's there, the worker placement mixed with fighting in a simpler game, could be quite good. I really like that. I liked the idea of, deciding, do I go out and sort of take, the action I most want to do, but that leaves me in a vulnerable position because of where that action is located geographically. Do I go out and fight Kellen because I know if I do this now, I'm going to hurt his ability to take an action on the spot that he might want to take next turn, because remember that adjacency thing. Because a lot of the time what you're doing is putting a worker down so that you can put another worker next to them on a subsequent turn. So there's some sense of like setting up where you're placing workers on subsequent turns, which allows you to meddle with other players quite effectively. The biggest problem, I think, with this is it's all mired by a combat system that just feels really bad to me.
I'm very interested in hearing about how this works.
It's not that elaborate. So the thing that's actually quite clever about the combat system is it's not very elaborate. It is simply every unit has a number of dice it contributes, right? So my workers contribute 1, my soldiers contribute 2, my dragons contribute 3, whatever, okay? You can spend swords, which are a resource, to add more dice to your fight. and you're rolling up to a maximum of 6 dice. But then it's as simple as roll all the dice, and whichever single highest die is available in that pool wins. So if I rolled, for example, 6 dice and I rolled 5 1s and a 6, and Kellen rolled all 5s, my 6 wins. Okay? If there's a tie, you go to the second highest die, and so on. So it's very, very quick and simple to resolve. But the problem with that is it ends up like very much muddying kind of the probabilistic like intuition you have. Because is 5 dice that much better than 4 dice? I don't know. Kellen can beat me with 1 die versus my 4 if he rolls a 6, and I don't roll a 6 on my 4 dice. So it doesn't feel correct, you know? Like 1 dice versus 4 dice should feel like an overwhelming force, and it oftentimes isn't, in a way that just can be aggravating. To be fair, like I don't think combat is really all that punishing, although it can be if it's done like opportunistically.
So I was going to ask you about that, because based on your description, it felt like it might. Because do you run the risk of losing the action if you're the person who placed on a spot? Okay, so you get to do the action.
So you always take the action, which I think is smart, because if it was like you're fighting for the right to do the action, that would be aggravating. But the problem is you're losing the opportunity to do an action.
Right. You lose the adjacency, and then you lose the benefit from pulling your workers off the board, right? Exactly. And so that doesn't necessarily feel super punishing in practice.
So again, it vacillates between feeling like negligible and feeling incredibly punishing.
Yeah.
You know? Because there will be times where it's like, I'm the yellow player. So I've been going up the yellow elements track because that's, where I was most attuned to. There's this house that is going to be the last yellow hex on the board. I've set up a worker there so that I can then now put a worker in another spot to build a house there. And then someone fights that worker and you're just like, okay, that sucks.
Yeah.
And that is, to some extent, the game. I shouldn't have done that if I couldn't defend that worker. But it just doesn't quite add up. It doesn't quite mesh the Euro efficiency puzzle with the wild silliness of the combat. And especially of the card effects. Because, again, some of them are quite bizarrely devastating. One of the cards is literally add a virtual 6 to the battle.
Right.
It's just like, that just feels silly. That's almost like an instant win in a lot of cases. It's very bizarre. I had this is going to sound harsher than I intended to, but I had a similar feeling to how I felt when we played Heroes of Land, Air, and Sea, which is just like this very elaborate, overwrought, sort of very, combat-y game where I just came away going, who is this for? It's not for the Euro purists. It's not for the very trashy people. And I can imagine the world. And let me caveat that to say, I don't think this is a bad game. We had fun with it. It's very silly, but I don't think it's a good game.
Can I ask you a question? You say we had fun with it.
Yeah.
Did Kellen have fun with it?
I think Kellen had more fun than he expected to in the opening of it, because part of the muddiness of this game is our starting map had 3 of Christina's blue tiles in it and none of ours. That's the sort of stuff that feels weird. The cards that come up are going to be so situational. The cards you draw are going to be so situational. There's so much wonkiness going on at all times. Within the second turn, Christina had taken over one of the monsters and was able to use that. So it was just like, what is happening? But it kind of evened out, and it became, what would be basically probably a 2-hour game or less with repeat plays. So not in the same length that these sorts of games can usually be very, very long as well. So in that sense, it was fine. I am not done with it, I would say. There's, a fair number of factions with interesting little abilities to explore, even though all of those feel like a balanced nightmare. I have to try this with kind of my less purist group and see if it sits with them, but I still think that there are just going to be the same frustrations with it. So overall, I would say I was pretty, unfortunately, disappointed with Dwellings of Eldervale. And, it had been very highly anticipated for me for a long time, so that has some bearing on this for sure. But I just don't think it's a
So
game
this
for
is I'm looking at pictures, a massive box, right? This is a super big. So did
Yes.
that also sort of carry over in terms of setup? I'm looking at pictures of it on the board, and it looks like a little unwieldy, but it's hard to tell if it is a setup monster or a table hog. What would you say?
I would say that it's more of a setup beast than it should be for a couple of reasons. Because in a 3-player game, for example, you choose your 3 faction colors, you add 2 more called random colors. So you're playing with 5 colors, which means you have to sort out all the tiles of those 5 colors, shuffle them up, get a specific combination of those tiles out, shuffle those together, create a map, then rearrange the tiles and shuffle them. Like, there's a little bit of fiddling to that. Then on every single one of these tiles, like a stack of little things is going to go. I will say this. The game, even in the base box, includes game trays inserts that are actually functionally useful in a way that is quite impressive. I think the production and the inserts actually go a long way to making the setup and the playing of the game quite pleasant, because it does the thing where your game trays is just your player board, effectively. So you open it up and your player board's ready to go, you know? And then you sort of take a stack of these tiles or things, slap them onto a tile, and you're done. So it does little things like that are quite pleasant. The production in general is quite lovely, again, even in the base game. And all of it, to its credit, fits in that box. You know, if you have all of the content for this game that is available, it all fits in that base game box, which is both cool and a little bit obnoxious if you only have the base game and you realize that half of the box is effectively like empty space. But I certainly can't complain about the production values. I have to sort of mention one thing, which I'm going to call out Woggers in our Discord on this. He insisted I get these sound bases for these miniatures.
Wait, what?
Mark.
Okay.
Imagine.
Can I guess?
Don't even worry. I'm gonna take you on the journey with me. Imagine, Mark, you see a giant monster miniature looming on a pedestal across the board. You're told that monster now needs to rush to attack you. You pick up the monster, you move into your hex, and it goes.
So what did you say? Sound base? They're called sound bases?
Sound bases, the new innovative tech coming to board games near you.
Okay, so it is what I thought, where like some of the minis have sound bases where they actually make a sound.
They make a sound, Mark, but they make the most 80s ass G.I. Joe sounding gurgle you've ever heard.
Okay. That's what I was sort of picturing.
It's incredibly silly.
Yeah.
We had a great time not telling Christina about that feature and watching her reaction, which was probably the highlight of the day.
That is funny.
But that is Dwellings of Eldervale, designed by Luke Laurie and published by Breaking Games.
Before we move on to our Essen preview, I just wanted to thank everybody for the positive reviews we got on Apple Podcasts. I mentioned on the last episode, I think, that we had gotten some less than stellar, or a less than stellar review. I want to be fair. And I was hoping to rally the troops to change the tide, and I'm happy to report that you all really came through. So I really, really appreciate that. I noticed one of the reviews, particularly titled A Perfect 7-Star Podcast, comes from, I think, the people who put on the excellent Games from the Cellar podcast. So shout out to them. People who have listened to that podcast will get the Perfect 7 reference. But yes, thank you guys. And thank you to everybody who left a review. That, again, not only helps us, I think, in algorithms, and everybody says that, but I think it actually does happen, sort of boosts our show in terms of the visibility. But also, and more importantly to me, whenever I see a report that we got a positive podcast, just makes my day. Always very, very nice. So it means a lot to us. And so thank you to all who contributed. And if you want to keep putting them up there, I'm certainly not going to turn you down. So thanks again.
Okay, let's get right into the meat of the episode. Our most anticipated games from Essen SPIEL in Germany this year.
Essen 2023.
Essen.
And so if Kellen were here, what do we normally do? We normally do 5 games apiece, right? So if Kellen were here...
Yeah, like a solid 5 games.
Yeah, so that equates to how many games overall? 5 times 3, quick math? You're the math
15.
guy? 15.
I don't know why that took me so long.
But it's just the 2 of us, so people are probably going to get, they're going to feel aggrieved, right? Because they're only going to get 10 games, because there's 2 of us times 5, that's worse, right? However, what are we going to do? We're going to go 8 apiece.
16 games.
Neil, and you're the guy, as I've previously mentioned. Can you tell me what is better, 16 or 15?
16 is higher than 15.
And also better, quantity over quality.
Better than 15. Better than 15. Better.
We've also said,
on like almost any scale, 16 is a better number than 15.
Right. In general, you want
by
to
any
16.
Metric. Sounds better.
Sweet 16.
Looks better.
Sweet 16. Big thing there.
No one's said sweet 15.
Right, exactly. So we are giving you more than you'd get in a 3-tank system. So
that is, what's the word I'm looking for?
What is the word you're looking for?
I don't know. I was going to say that's quality, but that's not what I was going to look for.
No, it's quantity.
Value.
Yes, that's value. Exactly. More bang for your buck. So all the money that you paid for this episode stretched you further.
This is where it went.
It's like a baker's dozen. Like the baker gives you a little extra.
Yeah.
We're giving you a little extra.
Yeah, exactly.
You open up that bag of donuts. You expect 15.
The angels share.
Yeah. The angel share. Is that like the same sort of concept?
think that's a whiskey term. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
Actually.
Sounds cool. Anyhow.
Okay, everybody. Mark.
Yes.
Start us off. What is number 8?
Sure. All right. So my number 8 game, I have to admit, I don't really understand it, despite the fact that it is a party game, and despite the fact that I have sort of read the back of the box. And generally in party games, you can read the back of the box and sort of understand what the general gist of the game is. And so, despite the fact that I have read the back of the box, still come away not sure what it is, I'm going to put The Same Game. It's called The Same Game, is my number 8 game. And primarily because this is a party game from Wolfgang Warsch, who has, designed some great games in general and very accessible games and great party games. So for those who don't know, Warsch is the designer of Quacks of Quedlinburg, Wavelength, the Gonchon Clever series, Illusions, like a bunch of really accessible party weight games. And this seems to be maybe like a categories-ish sort of game where you are trying to describe the similarities between words in terms of categories that they share, but there's some sort of trap category that you're trying to avoid. So you would expect, again, that reading the back of the box or reading the summary would sort of clarify how that works exactly. It does not, at least in my read of it, but I do trust Wolfgang Warsch to design really fun, accessible party games, and this looks bright and colorful in the ways that a lot of his games do. So there's no part of me that is concerned that this game is going to be less than great. So I'm always up for a fun, accessible party game, and I'm sure that The Same Game by Wolfgang Warsch is going to fit that criteria.
That's cool. I missed this somehow, despite loving Wolfgang Warsch. That's amazing. My 8th game, I hesitated to put it on here because it's like the hottest, most thumbed item on the geek list. But I will admit that I couldn't help but be intrigued by the idea of this, even though this has potentially the single worst box art I've ever seen in a board game. This is Among Cultists. It is a social deduction thriller, is the subtitle. And the whole premise, I don't know too much about this, but this is Among Us. Let's get that out of the way. It is the popular video game lockdown hit Among Us turned into a board game. Now, that actually, as a premise, is enough to get me super interested. I love social deduction games. I love the weird emergence that comes out of games that's not unlike what Station Fall goes for, which has been incredibly popular with me this year. So, Among Cultists, if done well, could be quite a good thing. I don't know that I have the faith based on the production values, the pedigree of the publisher and designer, but I want it to be good.
All right. My number 7 is a game that I just know that I may not be excited about it years from now, and it may suffer the same sort of diminishing returns that legacy games do. But I know that if I get Ticket to Ride Legacy, that I'm going to be able to play with a lot of people. There's a lot of people in my life who aren't really into board games, but do enjoy Ticket to Ride. My appreciation for Ticket to Ride has grown over the last couple of years because of how accessible it is and how much joy it brings to people who aren't necessarily board gamers. So the idea of playing Ticket to Ride, again, this is the usual suspects. You've got Rob Davio and you've got Matt Leacock and Alan Moon. So 3 heavyweights. You've got, Davio is the king of legacy games. Leacock is great from the Pandemic series of games. And obviously Mr. Moon is the designer of Ticket to Ride. So the pedigree is all there. And I love the idea of playing a legacy game and showing the sort of like flashes and the gimmicks of a legacy game to people in my life who aren't necessarily big board game players, but are big fans of Ticket to Ride. So I think that's going to be a fun series of games. So Ticket to Ride Legacy is my number 7 game.
My number 7 game is a little bit of a wild card pick because of all the games I was interested and looked into. This game is called Civolution. This is the one that was like very hard to get almost any details about, except that it is a Stefan Feld civilization themed game. Now, Stefan Feld, I have a bit of a hit and miss thing with. I mostly don't like what I think are considered his most popular games, but I love Oracle of Delphi. One of my absolute favorite games. I love In the Year of the Dragon. One of my favorite games. So I am always interested to play a new Feld game. You add on the civilization theme and I'm there. The only thing that I've been able to ascertain from unclear details of mostly secondhand is that it does have some sort of modular map type board. So it is capturing that element of the Civilization game, which is rare, of having a map potentially, a large number of actions, and kind of this typical sorts of things you'd expect from Civilization style games, going out, exploring, collecting resources, transporting them back, that sort of thing. So very vague in the details, but something that's very intriguing to me, both in theme and in the designer's pedigree. Civolution, a bad name, but Civolution.
Okay. My number 6 game is another one where I'm not really too sure about, and I promise all listeners that I get more sure about these games as we go up, but there's not too much that is out there about World Wonders. This is by designer Z Mendez, who was the designer of Brazil Imperial, which is another game that I have not played, but I'm interested in playing. Also designed a soccer game, so I'm always a fan of people who design soccer games. But again, this is World Wonders. It is a civilization/city building game, more of a city building game, I guess, than a civilization game, but does give Foundations of Rome vibes in terms of the overproduced city building thing. For those who are interested, take a look at some of the pictures on BGG, and it's got like really, really big building pieces, and it's got like a 3-dimensional quality and just really lovely on the table. It's an action point game where you spend action points depending on what you want to do, and I generally like action point games. One thing I don't like about them is sometimes keeping track of the action points you have to spend, and it gets around this. It's not like a really mind-blowing thing, but it gets around this by using gold. So you get gold and you spend it on your turn to take the actions you want to take. So I thought that was like sort of an elegant solution to my issue with action point games. But yeah, it looks lovely, and the designer has got some other games that I'm interested in, so I am eager to play World Wonders.
My number 6 game is Dying Message. This is kind of a small party game, but a fairly unknown Thai studio. This looks to be sort of a 20-minute social deduction game that is a hybrid of something like a Mafia, very vaguely, mixed with something like maybe a Deception or a Mysterium. So the idea being that you have a bunch of evidence cards on the table in front of you. One or two of the players, I forget how it works exactly, is the killer. And every round, everyone closes their eyes and the killer taps someone's hand and kills them. So they open their eyes, they get to see who the killer is, and then they choose an evidence card that is going to point the rest of the players to who they know the killer to be, like their dying message. The killer then sort of puts 2 more other evidence cards in just to muddle up the message a little bit, and then there's a reveal of who do I think Mark is trying to tell me based on these cards he's chosen. The thing that's a little bit unclear to me is whether you're actually trying to indicate something about the player specifically, because one of the examples I heard was, oh, here's a watch card, and Neelan always has his smartwatch on. So I don't know if that's the gist actually, or if there is some other mechanic that I wasn't able to ascertain about a role or a character that people have, but that's the kind of simple gist of it. So you keep going around slowly killing people, leading more and more towards who you think the killer is. Very simple idea, potentially very fun. I love games that kind of play in this space, so I'm intrigued to check this out. That is Dying Message.
It has a little bit of feeling of a Deception, Murder in Hong Kong a little bit based on your explanation. I'm looking at pictures of it, and it has a 16-bit art that I sort of like. It reminds me of like a video game from the Super Nintendo or the Genesis or something like that. So I like the art style. It does feel good. Okay, my number 5, and I think this is the only game that we've mentioned as a podcast earlier. I think maybe Kellen had it on his list for an anticipated game, but this is Kutná Hora, City of Silver, and I'm sure I've mispronounced the main title there. But as I think I mentioned when Kellen brought it up, it's got some major strikes against it for me. One is the box cover is super boring. It's just got like a silver coin on it. And the art itself, once you open that box, is super boring. Like it's got like very standard, although colorful, but very standard medieval art on it. So both of those are minuses. But in delving into this game a little bit more, it's got something that I'm very interested in, which is a very dynamic economic system, evidently, with like a very dynamic supply and demand economic system. So in general, I'm into economic games, and with this game sort of like staking its claim on how innovative and, again, dynamic the system is, makes me really, really interested in it. Also by CGE, which always releases, if not my favorite games, always interesting and sort of innovative and interesting games. So you put that all together, and it's a game that I'm looking forward to. In my past, I was less sensitive to art that didn't work for me, but as I've grown, that stuff has bothered me more, but I'm going to try to get past that and get back to the days of my youth when I didn't care about that and play Kutná Hora, the City of Silver.
I think you're doing it a bit of a disservice. I agree with the boxes.
Okay, wait, hold on. To be clear,
I do think there is a striking...
Before we go on, the box is terrible. The box is super boring, yeah.
The box is not great. But I do think that the art style of the board and the pieces, it's definitely surprising a little bit. It's like blacks and grays accented by color in a way that I think is quite striking.
I do really like how the color is used on the tiles that represent like the buildings I guess you're building, but the buildings are very standard Euro buildings. Sure. But yeah, no, I get your point. Yeah.
My fifth most anticipated game is a roll and write. Roll and writes are still great. They're still coming and they're still innovating. This roll and write is called Tiny Mini Golf, and this is a fairly novel little idea, which I thought was really cute. And I'm quite excited to see how well it's executed. Basically, you have a grid on your little player sheet. You're going to roll some dice representing bumpers or sand or your tee-off position or the flag, and what you're effectively creating is a little mini golf course. So there are 8 rounds of the game. The first 6 rounds, you're just drawing out basically the walls, plotting out the course of your mini golf course. And the idea being is you're trying to make a course that's going to be very, very hard for the player to your left to be able to complete. In the last 2 rounds of the game, you pass the sheet to them, you'll roll more dice, and they get 2 rounds just to slightly adjust it strategically to make it easier for them. Then there's a subsequent phase of the game where you're going to be rolling dice in order to complete your course. So you're going to be picking like a direction, saying, I'm going to go like a light, a medium, or a heavy hit, rolling some dice, seeing how far your ball travels, trying to like actually carry out the course. And your score at the end of the game is going to be a combination of how well you complete your neighbor's course, as well as how badly your other neighbor did on your course. So it's kind of trying to both complete a course well as create a very hard course for your neighbor. I just think that's a cute idea. I like that a lot. I like roll and writes that end up being more like drawing exercises more than just like putting numbers on a sheet. So I just like the way that this looks a lot. I also always like the pass the sheet to your neighbor and have them deal with it. So cute idea. I would love to see how this pans out. I hope it's good. That is Tiny Mini Golf.
I have to say, I'm not a fan of roll and writes in general, but I really do. I have not heard of this one, and I really do the idea of building a golf course and then handing it to your opponent to play. That's a really fun twist on them.
Yeah.
So I've just said that I don't like roll and writes. However, my number 4 is also a roll and writes, surprisingly enough.
Nice.
Although I have a strong feeling that I will end up, to be honest, I'm being honest with the listener here. In the end, I don't think I'm going to like this game, but it's just so outlandish.
But it's number 4 on your list.
Yes, I know, but it's so crazy. It deserves a number 4 spot. So this is Arabella, which is a 18xx themed roll and write game. I don't know how they're going to do this. And, we've had these massive games turn into roll and writes with varying success. Varying being sort of like a gracious term when you think of games like Twilight Inscription that didn't really work for us. But they're going to try to put 18xx into a roll and write. I'm looking at sort of pictures of it. I've read the gist of it, and I'm just fascinated. I don't know how it's going to work. It promises to do it in 45 to 90 minutes. So if they can make it work, then, I'm certainly going to get my hands on a copy. There's no way you're going to tell me there's an 18xx roll and write and I'm not going to at least try it. I don't know how you succeed, but I'm willing to give it a shot for sure. So this is Arabella. And speaking of weird covers, the cover has a train on it, and then there's a cat that is playing with the train. So very weird in a number of ways, but that's my number 4 game, Arabella.
I can see my first 18xx in my future.
That's right. That's funny.
My number 4 game is ArcheOlogic. This is very, very clearly inspired by Search for Planet X and a healthy dose of Turing Machine as well. So similar to Planet X, this is a deduction game where what you're trying to do is there is for any given scenario that you're playing, which is dictated by a bunch of pre-printed cards. So you put this big printed card with this sort of mess of symbols and code that's completely illegible in the middle. And what that is signifying at the end of the day is in your 5x5 grid, a very specific layout of 6 polyomino tiles on that grid in very precise positions, orientations, etc. So a very specific layout of these 6 polyomino tiles. And only once you've found out exactly where every polyomino goes on your 5x5 grid have you solved the puzzle. The way that this works is similar to Planet X, like a patchwork style timing system where whoever is the furthest behind in time, takes the next action, choosing what type of action they're going to take. A query to the machine, as it were. Is my building in the column that we're currently investigating? How many buildings are in the column that we're currently investigating? For the L-shaped building, is which symbols that are on the building appear in this column? So that sort of thing. You ask the machine, I guess maybe the titular ArcheOlogic, how this works with this very elaborate sort of like paper wheel type mechanism that you sort of rotate dials on, put over the card, and then through the windows that will appear on the card, certain symbols will appear answering your question. Similar to like how very cleverly Turing Machine is engineered, for example. So in a series of turns where you're asking questions to the machine, getting information, you're slowly deducing the layout of your polyominoes. Both of those games are games I love a lot. Planet X in particular is probably my favorite deduction game. So anything that is trying to do something in the same space is instantly intriguing to me. And I like polyomino games. So that is ArcheOlogic.
My number 3 most anticipated game harkens back to the game I talked about at the beginning of the episode, Asara, and that is because it is by the same design duo. So this is another Kiesling and Kramer game. And this is Terra Pyramidis, a game about building pyramids. Again, the biggest selling point for this was Kramer and Kiesling being the design team on it, and also the theme. As an Egyptian myself, I'm always down to play an Egyptian-themed game. And also, in looking at the game, it gives me very big Palaces of Carrara vibes, which is another Kramer and Kiesling game that I think is sort of underrated. Another edition came out for it, I think, last year, but a game that I've always enjoyed and I think is underrated. This seems to be a very old-school Euro sort of design where there's not a lot of fluff to it. It's a great looking game. You're building pyramids and there are little 3D mini pyramids that you're putting on the board, but it seems to be, again, in the Kramer Kiesling sort of vein of very sound, straightforward, relatively small rule set sort of game. So I've just been playing a lot of those types of games in the recent past and have really enjoyed them. So just looking forward to more, again, sort of solid, straightforward, easy to play, easy to teach Euros. So that is Terra Pyramidis.
My number 3 game is by a little-known designer called Dr. Rainer Knizia. Have you heard of him, Mark?
I don't think so, but can you tell me a little bit more about him?
He's a medical doctor.
Gotcha.
And in his spare time at the ER, he designs a board game or two. Okay. Sunrise Lane is a half-an-hour game that seems to have a little bit of a dash of the Doctor's previous Millefiori in it, where you have cards that are going to dictate where you're going to be able to place houses onto this shared board. It doesn't have the same sort of drafting structure. Instead, it's kind of closer to hand management, whether you're going to be spending 1 card or 2 cards of a specific color in order to place multiple houses in a stack on a given space on the board. But this is a shared board where you're going to be blocking spaces from other players, taking the spaces at opportune times before other players can get them, in order to build these lovely little stacks of houses in this city grid. It seems fairly simple. It seems to sort of have elements of other games that I just love from Dr. Rainer Knizia, as is, very typical of his designs. You feel like you've seen elements of it before, but remixed in a way that feels pretty unique and new. That is Sunrise Lane.
So it looks like the re-implementation of an older game of his called Rondo, I guess from 2012. So I guess the guy has been designing games for a little while.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, that's 10 years. Wow, that's kind of wild. Just being around doing his thing and going under the radar.
You'd expect I'd heard more games from him if he's been doing it for this long. But anyway, so my number 2 most anticipated game from Essen 2023 is a Vladimir Suchy game. This is Evacuation. So I generally like anything by Vladimir Suchy. Another game of his that I very much enjoy that I didn't put on the list because it's a reprint is Shipyard. But I've played a bunch of Suchy games recently, Pulsar, and have enjoyed to one level or another Underwater Cities, most of his games. So I'm excited for his latest one, Evacuation, in which I guess you are the world is exploding or dying or something crashing to Earth or something, and you need to evacuate and move to another planet. So the goal is to get your people off of Earth and onto another planet. The thing that is interesting about it, the main twist, is something I'm interested in, but also a little apprehensive of. But again, I'll play any Suchy game. But the idea is that while you're on Earth is obviously dying or about to explode, but you have a fully fledged economy when the game starts. Like you have your engine built as, I guess, as good as it's going to be at the beginning. And then gradually as the game goes on and as you're trying to transport your economy to the new planet, you're sort of like pulling it apart is my understanding. And so in general, I'm a little concerned when a game has you start with your engine in its best version and instead of building it up, you're sort of breaking it down. That can feel a little anticlimactic as you're sort of going from strength to weakness. But again, with Suchi, I'm very confident. And if done right, I think that can be a really interesting twist on a game or game design. So my number 2 game is Vladimir Suchi's Evacuation.
My number 2 game is a game that, Mark, I think had you seen this, you probably would have it on your list too. This is TwinStar Valley. This is a fairly small, accessible logistics game, which the designer describes as his love letter to logistics games. It's inspired by Age of Steam. It is shared board, building routes out on an adorably tiny little map in order to transport goods from factories to other locations. The games in this realm that I love, like stuff like Railways of the World, I often feel like when these sorts of route building games are at their simplest, that's when I tend to enjoy them more. So trying to distill this down into a very, very accessible form that plays in about an hour is pretty notable to me. I like the idea of that a lot. It looks like it has a very adorable aesthetic as well for a solidly medium weight interactive logistics game.
Interesting. I'm looking at it, and as you guessed, I had not heard of this. As you said, a logistics game with a 2.5 weight on BGG, so that's a relatively light. So yeah, I'm very interested in how this is going to work out. So yeah. And my most anticipated number 1 game from Essen 2023 is Planta Nubo. From
my number 1 most anticipated game is also Planta.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, this actually gives us a little problem. We've promised the listeners 16 games. We actually only have 15.
We should have really consulted before we made all those claims. But
that's actually really great. Yeah, because overwhelmingly, I like the look of a lot of games on my list, but this one really stood out and I'm excited to play.
Yeah, and for me, the design pedigree is, again, what really struck out. This is by Michael Keller and Odie, who are the designers of La Granja, which is a game that I have been playing a lot more recently and really, really grown to enjoy. This is another game that has been blooming in repeated plays. And I like Odie's designs in general. They're always sort of unique. And then also the third member of the design team is Uwe Rosenberg. So
Uwe Rosenberg!
That's right. So another big heavyweight design space. So yeah, when I saw that and I saw like how beautiful the design looks and the art looks, it got me interested immediately.
Yeah, this is kind of really like the whole package for me. I've kind of skimmed the rule book, but it has, I hate to say it, but polyominoes where you're sort of building them out onto your grid. You have a lot of available actions, which determines like whether you're acquiring those polyominoes. Every time you place them onto your board, they sort of have flowers that you then have to get freight trucks to be able to deliver them to, or to a shared board in the middle. There's this whole separate system of like actions in a wheel that you're sort of slowly building out and acquiring the energy to move them around. So a lot of different systems. This feels, a medium heavy game, like closer to the Feast for Odin end of the scale potentially, but all married with a very lovely theme and really a stunning look. Like it is quite a lovely production with really beautiful art.
Absolutely. I will say that I'm a little worried that I'm done with polyominoes, but if anybody's going to, keep me interested, it's going to be obviously Uwe Rosenberg. But yeah, no, like you said, the full package, everything about this looks interesting. So yeah, definitely number 1 on my list for sure.
So that is it for our, 15 most anticipated games of Essen SPIEL. But do we have any other games that we want to point to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned before Shipyard, which is, again, stayed off my list only because it's a reprint. It looks really, really nice. The original edition was a little sort of gray and brown, but a game that I really enjoyed by Vladimir Suchi. So it's going to get retooled in a second edition. Speaking of second editions, I'm also excited about the Black Friday reprint, which is a Friedman Friese game that I have enjoyed. It's going to be a nice reprint that's being done. I'm also interested in Apiary, which is the latest Stonemaier game about, it's about bugs?
Yeah, like about space bees.
Oh, is it about space bees? Okay. I guess about space bees. Distant future, humans no longer inhabit Earth. Okay. I knew it was about bugs and, with the Stonemaier sort of wingspan thing, the production's always going to be, off the scale, and with a theme as lush or as potentially deep to explore as insects, I thought obviously got me excited to try that potentially. Unconscious Mind is a game that I'm really interested in. It seems like a really, really heavy game that might have some interesting aspects to it. So Unconscious Mind was also just off my list. So yeah, what about you?
Speaking of really heavy, did you take a look at Nucleum, which seems to be like a barrage successor to some extent that seemed like it might be up your alley?
I just, come on, man.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested
you.
in it for sure, and it seems to be one of the hotter games at the con. But then I started reading about it, and I'm like, oh my god, I don't want to power things. I don't want to power things with Steam. I'm tired of it.
Yeah, for me, a couple of the standouts are, some of these are like semi-known quantities at this point. Sky Team, I feel, has been getting a lot of buzz as a 2-player cooperative game. I love Le Scorpion Masqué. I think that they do some very, very interesting lighter designs. Witchcraft, a solo game by Trevor Benjamin and David Thompson, and also Roger Tankersley, I should say, 2 of whom are the design team behind Undaunted. This is a solo game that I'm very interested about because of the design pedigree.
And so, yeah, if you are going to Essen, or if you're at Essen now, let us know what you thought about those games, or maybe let us know what games you saw that maybe we didn't mention that you enjoyed. Very interested to hear from our European or our European traveling listeners what they discovered.
Absolutely, yeah. And as always, we're very intrigued to hear what you say in our Discord. If you have some games that you are excited for at the show, if you're going to be at Essen and are planning on picking some of these up, please let us know. We'd love to hear about what we've been missing out on. That is at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Heading over there if you just want to chat with other like-minded board game players or members of our community. Everyone is a very, very lovely person in that Discord. Otherwise, you can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com or suggest topics for future episodes at boardgamebarrage.com/topics. Thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro music. What's in Your Mind, Kid? That is going to do it for this week. Goodbye.
Goodbye.